A black businessman was kicked out of his VIP seat to make room for a white passenger. Minutes later, he revealed his identity and fired the entire cabin crew. They told him he didn't belong in the VIP section. They had no idea the man they humiliated owned more of the airline than their entire department combined. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on appearance. The announcement chime faded, leaving only the low murmur of passengers and the mechanical hum of the air vents. Dominic Vale stepped into the narrow aisle of Flight Mariner 418, the polished leather under his shoes glinting faintly beneath the overhead lights. His boarding pass still rested between two fingers, creased slightly at the edges from how tightly he held it. The scent of citrus disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of jet fuel and freshly brewed coffee. Every movement he made was deliberate, measured, the kind of calm that made people instinctively step aside. He wasn't just another traveler. He carried himself like a man who had long learned that control, not noise, commanded respect. The lead flight attendant, Mark Delvin, greeted him with the mechanical warmth of customer service. "Welcome aboard, sir." "May I see your ticket?" His smile faltered the moment his eyes met the embossed lettering on Dominic's boarding pass, VIP Suite 1A. For a brief second, Mark's gaze flicked past Dominic toward another man seated further ahead, an older white passenger with silver hair, expensive cufflinks, and the lazy posture of someone accustomed to being accommodated. A subtle exchange of uncertainty passed between them. Then, as if rehearsed, Mark's smile returned, thinner this time. "Sir," he began carefully, "there's been an adjustment. Your seat's been reassigned to accommodate a premium client." Dominic's brows lifted slightly. "A premium client?" His tone was polite, but beneath it ran a current of disbelief sharp enough to cut glass. "That seat was reserved weeks ago, confirmed twice by your office." Mark shifted his weight, one hand clutching his clipboard tighter. "Yes, well, there was a late boarding update, company directive. We'll be happy to relocate you to a seat in economy." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the plane as if expecting Dominic to nod and comply. For a moment, Dominic simply looked at him. The air around them seemed to thicken. The quiet shuffle of other passengers slowed as a few turned to glance at the scene. The captain's distant voice echoed faintly from the cockpit, announcing final boarding procedures, but inside the cabin, tension had replaced the usual pre-flight bustle. Dominic's expression remained calm, but his stillness carried the weight of controlled fury. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly, voice low yet resonant. His eyes, dark and unwavering, fixed on Mark with quiet authority. Mark hesitated, caught off guard by the composed defiance in Dominic's tone. Behind him, the older man, Clyde Rennan, cleared his throat pointedly. "Son, I believe that seat was reassigned to me. I was told it was a booking oversight." His voice carried entitlement, the kind that had gone unchallenged for decades. He adjusted his cufflinks without looking up, his tone casual but condescending. "I'm sure the airline can find you something comfortable elsewhere." Dominic turned his head slightly, studying him. There was no anger in his gaze, only a clinical detachment, as though he were already cataloging the incident for later. "You're welcome to your comfort," Dominic replied quietly, "but this isn't about comfort." He handed Mark the boarding pass again. "It's about principle." Mark's jaw tightened. "Sir, we need to complete boarding. Please comply, or I'll have to—" "You'll have to what?" Dominic interrupted softly. The tone wasn't loud, yet it carried through the cabin like the edge of a blade. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Even the nearby passengers seemed to draw back instinctively. The assistant, standing 2 rows behind Dominic, Evan Rain, lowered his phone discreetly, recording what was happening. He had seen that look in Dominic's eyes before, the one that meant something irreversible had just begun. Mark's professionalism began to crack under the weight of that silence. He looked toward his junior attendant, Brett Halser, who stepped forward, puffing his chest in a show of authority. "Sir, if you refuse to move, we'll have to involve airport security, Brett said, his words clipped, defensive. The irony hit Dominic immediately. The aircraft model they were standing in, an Ethereum 9X, was designed, built, and supplied by his own company. Every system humming beneath their feet bore the Ethereum insignia. He had personally signed off on its final software certification. And now, 2 employees of the airline using his technology were threatening to remove him from his own creation. Dominic exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping over the pair of attendants. The hum of the engines preparing for departure vibrated faintly through the floor, a subtle reminder of his reach. "No need for security," he said at last. "I'll move." His tone was calm, but his eyes promised remembrance. The quiet way he stepped back toward the business class section only deepened the unease in the air. The humiliation was sharp, but fleeting. What remained was calculation. He took an empty seat by the window, the faint reflection of the cabin lights rippling across the glass. Behind him, whispers spread like sparks through dry grass. "That's the CEO of Ethereum Holdings," one passenger murmured to another. "The plane literally runs on his company's systems." The attendants pretended not to hear. Clyde Rennan settled into the VIP seat with a satisfied sigh, glancing back just once before returning to his champagne. Mark straightened his tie and motioned for the cabin door to close, unaware that every second of his smugness was being documented. As the aircraft began to taxi down the runway, Dominic's breathing steadied. His humiliation cooled into something far more dangerous than anger, clarity. He opened his phone and typed a brief message to his assistant, fingers moving with precise deliberation. Archive everything. They just terminated themselves. He hit send, then placed the phone face down on the armrest, his expression unreadable. Outside, the runway lights blurred into streaks as the plane lifted into the night sky. But inside Dominic's mind, the course had already shifted. Every insult had a cost, and he intended to collect, methodically, legally, and without ever raising his voice. The engines roared, drowning out all traces of the earlier whispers. Yet, even in that noise, one truth settled quietly across the cabin. This was no longer an ordinary flight. "They thought I was a passenger," Dominic thought, his gaze fixed ahead. "They'll soon learn I'm the consequence." He leaned back, the faint hum of machinery beneath his seat reminding him of ownership and irony alike, and as the cloud swallowed the plane's outline, his calm returned, sharper, colder, and absolute. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly, his mind already calculating what this insult would cost them. Dominic didn't move. The aisle had gone quiet. The crisp rustle of boarding passes and the metallic clink of overhead bins settling faded beneath the weight of unspoken tension. Mark Delvin, the lead flight attendant, stood beside him with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, one hand still raised toward the rear of the plane. His voice had lowered, but the threat in it lingered. "Sir," Mark repeated, slower now, "we can discuss this after takeoff. Please comply now." Dominic's gaze didn't shift. He didn't raise his voice or even blink. He simply stared at the man, his expression carved from calm disbelief. All around them, passengers peered over headrests and between seats, pretending not to listen. Some held phones up in casual angles, feigning games or emails while quietly recording. "I believe there's been a mistake," Dominic said at last, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "That seat," he nodded subtly toward the VIP suite now occupied by the older man in the beige blazer, "was assigned to me." Mark's smirk deepened and something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Yes, well, we've had a last-minute reallocation to accommodate a premium client." Dominic tilted his head slightly. "And I am not one." The attendant hesitated, just a beat too long before stepping aside with a gesture toward the economy cabin, as though the matter were settled. "We're asking you to cooperate, sir." The man, now sitting in Dominic's seat, a white-haired retiree with soft hands and a nervous smile, glanced up, clearly aware of the imbalance. He offered a half-hearted shrug, mouthing something that resembled, "Sorry," but didn't offer to move. His fingers curled tighter around the armrest as though defending a prize he hadn't earned. Dominic inhaled slowly. His eyes moved over the aisle, across the luxurious suite that was supposed to be his. He noticed the chilled champagne waiting in the holder beside the seat, the folded blanket, the personalized screen with the airline's welcome message that still bore Mr. D. Vale before it refreshed. He turned his gaze back to Mark. "You're making a mistake." Before Mark could reply, a second attendant approached. Brett Halser, tall, with slicked-back hair and the stiffness of someone playing a role he barely understood. "Is there a problem?" Brett asked, his tone louder than necessary. Passengers leaned in now, pretending to stretch, adjust headrests, retrieve magazines they'd already read. "This gentleman is delaying takeoff," Mark replied, shifting his body to face his coworker, but loud enough for the cabin to hear. Dominic didn't react outwardly. Inside, his mind was already calculating, precision replacing emotion. He knew this aircraft model, knew the operating systems embedded behind the panels, the data streams flowing through the digital consoles. Ethereum's name wasn't on the paint outside the plane, but its code was inside every circuit. Brett stepped forward, arms crossed. "Sir, if you don't sit down, we'll have to involve security." It was a bluff. Dominic saw it instantly. The cabin door had already closed. They wouldn't delay an international flight for optics, not over a dispute they thought would fade in the press. Still, the warning rang louder than intended. Dominic shifted his attention for the first time to the name tags pinned to their starched uniforms. Delvin, Halser. He memorized them with the same efficiency he applied to acquisition terms and high-level mergers. "Understood," he said quietly, the words flat and even. Then he turned without another glance and stepped into the business class section. There were still seats available. Comfortable enough, yes, but a sharp fall from the suite he had secured weeks ago through corporate channels. As he sat down, he felt the burn of humiliation not on his face, but beneath the surface, in the place where dignity resided. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, straightened his back, and allowed himself no visible trace of emotion. 2 rows behind him, his assistant, Elijah Marnus, barely moved. A phone rested on his tray, its camera angled just right. No words passed between them, only a nod. The cabin lights dimmed. The familiar hum of the engines swelled. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. Mark passed through the aisle, shooting Dominic a fleeting glance of smug triumph, then leaned over to Brett near the galley. Can you believe he thought he belonged there? Their muffled laughter disappeared into the roar of acceleration. Dominic reached into the side compartment of his seat and retrieved his tablet. It lit with a quiet pulse. No airline Wi-Fi required. He connected directly through a secured uplink routed through Ethereum's own orbital comms relay. A flick of his finger unlocked a classified dashboard. Not every executive had access to it. Only 3 did. Rows of data unfurled, contracts, access points, vendor chains, infrastructure licensing. He selected Mariner Holdings and tagged the live flight designation. Cross-referenced the assigned aircraft. In less than 5 seconds, the interface confirmed that this aircraft's software core, cabin telemetry, and predictive maintenance system were all operating under Ethereum's proprietary license. Dominic didn't smile. He didn't allow himself the satisfaction, not yet. He typed a short message to Elijah. The assistant received it immediately on his screen. It read, "Archive everything. They just terminated themselves." Can you believe he thought he belonged there? The words were whispered, but not soft enough to go unnoticed. Dominic Vale heard them clearly. They drifted back through the cabin like the scent of warmed plastic and brewed coffee, unavoidable, acrid, and disrespectful. The voice belonged to Brett Halser, one of the attendants, speaking with a casual arrogance to a fellow crew member as they passed through the aisle. There was a snicker that followed, the kind that doesn't just mock, it confirms conspiracy. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't look back or up. Instead, he slowly reached for his laptop, his movements measured and precise, as though conducting a quiet ritual. He opened the sleek black casing, its edges polished and understated, and pressed the biometric reader. A soft blue light blinked twice. Then the screen came alive. Outside the windows, clouds churned like distant tides. Inside the cabin, the air had shifted, no longer simply cold or stale, but hostile. It wasn't just a seating change anymore. It was something deeper, a challenge, a message. Mark Delvin passed by again, walking like a man who'd won a game no one else realized they were playing. He cast a glance over his shoulder at Dominic, short but loaded with smug satisfaction, as if to say, "Stay in your place." Dominic's fingers tapped swiftly across the keyboard, his mind already 4 steps ahead. Within moments, his laptop connected to Ethereum's secure satellite network, bypassing the commercial Wi-Fi entirely. A secure channel flickered into view. His assistant, seated 2 rows behind, noticed the blinking signal on his device and quickly opened his own terminal. The 2 screens synced silently across an encrypted bridge that only Ethereum's senior executive staff could access. Dominic's screen loaded a classified internal dashboard. Ethereum Holdings, Executive Rights Management Interface. Dozens of cascading modules unfolded, partner contracts, license dependencies, clearance tiers. He narrowed in on the tab labeled Mariner Airlines, Operational Integration. The screen showed a breakdown of the airline's technical dependencies, avionics, diagnostics, even cabin software, all marked as Powered by Ethereum Defense Systems, version 7.9. He scrolled further. One of the tabs read, Leasing plus Maintenance, Tier 2 Override Protocols, Active. Dominic stared at that line for a long moment, breathing quietly through his nose. His pulse was steady, but his jaw had tightened slightly. The irony wasn't lost on him. The airline that had just demoted him in public ran its aircraft systems, flight control, telemetry, even in-flight safety diagnostics on Ethereum's proprietary tech. His tech, and not only that, but the airline's compliance license was due for quarterly review within 2 weeks, a review that couldn't legally proceed without his sign-off. Dominic's eyes flicked back to the cabin aisle. Mark was now pouring a glass of champagne for Clyde Rennan, the older white man who had unknowingly inherited Dominic's VIP suite. Clyde chuckled at something Mark said. They clinked glasses like old friends. Clyde didn't look malicious, just comfortably indifferent, which was worse. Dominic's assistant leaned forward slightly in his seat, whispering just loud enough to be heard over the hum of the engines. "You're not going to." Dominic didn't turn to face him. He didn't need to. He gave a subtle, deliberate nod, as if acknowledging an inevitability rather than making a decision. "Not yet," he murmured. Then he closed his laptop with a soft click, letting the darkness of the screen reflect the overhead cabin lights. His expression remained neutral, composed, but in his mind the wheels were already turning. The seats on this flight were no longer just leather and stitching. They were battlegrounds of perception. His was taken, yes, but the power that had built it hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply returned to its source. Let them smile. Let them laugh. Let them believe he had been reduced to silence. That illusion was essential. Dominic folded his hands over his lap, the quiet hum of the engines masking the silent precision of his strategy. Let them think I'm powerless first. "Sir, would you like anything to drink?" The question came lightly, almost carelessly from the flight attendant as he passed Dominic's row. His voice was polite, rehearsed, but the way he barely made eye contact made the intent unmistakable. The tray lingered for a moment longer than necessary before gliding away. Dominic didn't respond. He simply gave a small shake of his head, returning his gaze to the window. Outside, the night sky stretched like a velvet sheet, stars pinned against its endless black. He didn't move, didn't speak, but every muscle in his body was coiled with quiet restraint. A moment later, turbulence struck, not enough to shake the plane violently, but just enough to make the cabin lights flicker and loosen the grip on casual conversation. Luggage compartments trembled overhead. Seatbelts clicked. A low beep sounded and the captain's voice came calmly over the intercom. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be passing through a mild patch for the next few minutes." That was when the man across the aisle leaned slightly toward Dominic. He was in his mid-30s, thin frame, dark blazer, and sharp brown eyes. "I saw what happened," he said in a low voice, careful not to attract attention. "That was wrong. You were treated unfairly." Dominic turned his head slightly. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm, composed. "Rowan." "Rowan Holt," the man replied. "Systems engineer. I work in propulsion integration. Your company's a bit of a North Star for people like me." Dominic nodded once, the smallest sign of acknowledgement. "Then you understand the systems they're flying on," he said without inflection. Rowan's eyes flickered with recognition. "More than they do." They said nothing more. That was all that needed to be said. As the plane stabilized and the artificial calm returned, Dominic leaned back in his seat, his mind sifting through every detail with the precision of a man who didn't let emotion drive action. 2 rows ahead, Clyde Rennan chuckled as another glass of champagne was poured for him. Brett Halser stood nearby, chatting amiably, throwing a glance over his shoulder now and then, never quite toward Dominic, but just enough to make it clear he knew who had been displaced. Mark Delvin passed again, this time with a faint whistle on his lips, performing a theatrical stretch as if nothing had happened at all. "Can you believe he thought he belonged there?" Brett whispered to a nearby crew member with a smirk. The words were low, but the cabin was quiet. Dominic heard them. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His fingers moved over his phone in his lap, almost idly. With a few discreet taps, he accessed the Ethereum secure channel, using a biometric thumb verification that scanned through the protective film of his screen. A prompt appeared. "Ethics channel secure, ready for upload." He tapped once. The video, silently filmed by his assistant during the initial confrontation, was already cued. He didn't even need to preview it. He knew it by memory now. The tone of Mark's voice, the stiff posture of Brett, the expressions on the watching passengers' faces. Another tap. "Transmitting to Nathan Corvin, Legal and Ethics Division. Status: sent." Far across the ocean, thousands of miles from cruising altitude, a phone buzzed in a quiet office at Ethereum's headquarters. Nathan Corvin, a shrewd, methodical man with gray temples and sharp eyes, leaned forward in his chair as he reviewed the notification. A few seconds later, he clicked the file. The video opened to a frozen frame of Dominic being addressed by Mark Delvin. Nathan's expression darkened as he pressed play. By the end of the 45-second clip, his jaw was set. "They don't know who they're dealing with," Nathan muttered under his breath. Without a moment's hesitation, he opened Ethereum's internal disciplinary network and initiated a breach of conduct protocol under Client Abuse Clause 7D. Flags triggered. Internal AI systems swept across contract databases and pulled relevant documentation. Automated audits kicked off without fanfare, sending silent pings to HR, legal, and external relations. Nathan didn't even look away from his screen as he made the call. "Get me the board liaison. We're going to need a preliminary compliance audit on Mariner Airlines. Start now." Back on the flight, Dominic didn't know the exact moment the wheels had begun turning, but he felt it. He could always feel it. His company didn't run on luck. It ran on systemized responses and surgical precision. Another attendant passed him without a glance. Dominic sat still. He didn't feel anger anymore. That had burned off long ago, somewhere between takeoff and betrayal. What remained now was clarity. The kind that only came to men who understood patience was more dangerous than fury. He reached for his laptop, opened it slowly, and pulled up the control panel for Ethereum's executive operations interface. His permissions gave him limited access to affiliated client configurations. He could see Mariner's compliance logs, their partnership expiration dates, the embedded software suites currently running diagnostics on their fleet. A small icon blinked amber beside a line labeled Flight 418, Integrity Review Pending. He didn't click it. Not yet. There was still time for them to realize what they'd done. Mark passed again. Another smug half-smile. Dominic didn't blink. Beside him, Rowan adjusted in his seat, glancing briefly at the closed laptop and then at the man beside it. "You're not going to—" he began to ask, his voice unsure. Dominic gave a small nod. Just once. A signal of confirmation, but also restraint. "Not yet," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "Let them think I'm powerless first." Power, he thought, is best exercised when they still believe they have it. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the tires humming against the tarmac as the engines roared into idle. Seatbelt signs pinged overhead. Passengers around Dominic Vale unlatched their belts in a flurry of motion, some already half standing before the aircraft had come to a complete stop. Dominic, however, remained seated. His hands were folded neatly over his lap, and his gaze was fixed forward, unreadable. Mark Delvin, the lead flight attendant, moved toward the front, pretending to adjust a tray latch. His steps were unusually hurried, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Dominic as he passed. It was a glance born not of confidence, but of the kind of doubt that clings after you've insulted the wrong man and started to suspect it. As the cabin doors hissed open and sunlight poured in, the air inside felt strangely stagnant. The same crew who had smirked, ignored, and dismissed Dominic hours earlier now avoided looking at him altogether. Their voices dropped to quiet, overly polite tones as they said goodbye to passengers, offering smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Dominic finally rose from his seat, adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit, and stepped into the aisle. Mark Delvin was stationed near the door, trying to summon a semblance of charm as each person passed. When Dominic approached, Mark stood straighter and offered a tight-lipped smile. "Have a pleasant evening, sir," he said, voice clipped but professional. Dominic paused just long enough to meet his gaze. His expression was calm, almost too calm, like still water hiding an undertow. "You'll remember this evening longer than I will," he said, his voice quiet, even, and piercing. Then, without waiting for a response, he walked down the jet bridge with the calm precision of a man who had already written the next chapter of the day without using ink. Outside the gate, the airport was alive with the usual buzz of arrivals. Dominic moved through the terminal with deliberate steps, ignoring the whispers and the few passengers who had caught glimpses of the earlier confrontation. He reached the baggage claim, standing beneath the fluorescent lights as the carousel began its slow rotation. His phone vibrated. He answered it without glancing at the screen. The voice on the other end was direct, businesslike, and familiar. Nathan Corvin, his legal advisor. "Dominic, the airline's under partial contract with our aerospace subsidiary," Nathan said. No greeting, no small talk. "You have the authority to suspend their executive privileges pending review." Dominic's eyes remained fixed on the carousel. A single red suitcase clunked onto the belt. His wasn't among them yet. "Then we'll begin the review tonight," Dominic said evenly. Nathan didn't need further instruction. He knew what that meant. The legal wheels had already started to turn. Elsewhere, in a modest hotel 10 minutes from the airport, Mark Delvin entered his room, tossed his blazer on the chair, and rubbed his face with both hands. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling of unease since the flight. Something about the way Dominic had stared at him, quiet, focused, unreadable, made his stomach knot in ways he couldn't explain. His phone buzzed with an incoming email. Subject: Employment Suspension. pending inquiry. Mark's heart sank. He opened it. The content was short, formal, and devastating. Effective immediately, he was to refrain from reporting to work. A formal hearing was being scheduled. The sender, Internal Affairs, flagged with an Ethereum Holdings compliance seal. Not the airline's own department, this came from higher up. In a separate hotel across town, Brett Halser dropped his duffel bag on the bed and glanced at his screen as the same notification pinged. For a moment, he just stared, reading the email twice, then a third time, as though each reading would make the words disappear. But they didn't, and he knew why. Back at the airport, Dominic's suitcase finally arrived. He lifted it with one hand and wheeled it calmly to the parking garage. The evening light poured through the glass walls, catching on his suit, reflecting in the chrome trim of his waiting car. He slid into the back seat as the driver silently closed the door behind him. The engine started. The city lit up beyond the windshield, buildings glowing, traffic humming, 1,000 lives moving in parallel. Dominic didn't look at the skyline. His eyes were on the screen of his phone, where a folder labeled Flight 418, Preliminary Evidence, had just synced to his secure cloud. He tapped the screen off and leaned back, letting the silence of the cabin settle around him like a shield. They had taken his seat. They had tried to shrink him down to the title of passenger, but they had forgotten who designed the flight paths they operated under. As the car glided onto the expressway, Dominic whispered to himself, voice barely audible but steady, like a verdict already handed down. They thought I was a passenger. I was their employer. Sometimes the quietest man in the room holds the loudest consequence. The internal memo hit inboxes at 7:02 a.m. Subject line, Urgent Disciplinary Action, Flight 418 Crew. By 7:16 a.m., the halls of Mariner Airlines Operations Building buzzed with hushed voices and flashing phone screens. 4 names had been listed under Immediate Corporate Suspension Pending Review, and at the top was Mark Delvin. His confident, authoritative persona had evaporated by the time he pushed through the main glass doors. His blazer was misbuttoned. A thin line of sweat had formed at his temple. He walked fast, but not with purpose, with panic. "Mark!" called a voice near the elevator bay. It was Troy Kennan from scheduling. "You okay, man?" "Something happen on 418? Mark didn't answer. He jabbed the elevator button too many times as if speed could shield him from what was coming. When the doors opened, Halden Voss, the company's HR director, was waiting inside, alone, holding a thick, stapled report. "Mr. Delvin," Voss said coolly, stepping aside. "Come with me." The ride was silent. Voss didn't make eye contact. Mark's breathing quickened. He followed the director into a conference room with no windows. The air felt sterile, filtered, interrogative. Voss laid the report on the table like it was evidence in a trial. He didn't sit. "Do you realize who that man was?" His voice wasn't raised, but it carried weight. Mark tried to clear his throat, but it came out dry. He said he was a passenger. Claimed there was a mix-up with seating. Voss leaned forward, his knuckles on the table. "That passenger is Dominic Vale, founder and CEO of Ethereum Holdings, the very company that powers every operating system in our fleet, including the cockpit interface you trained on last year." Mark blinked. The name hadn't clicked before, not fully. He remembered the polished shoes, the unreadable expression, the stillness. That man had barely said a word. Voss opened the report. Inside were screenshots, video stills, transcripts of in-flight communication logs. He didn't need to flip pages to make his point. "Your behavior, Mr. Delvin, has now triggered a formal inquiry, initiated not by Mariner, but by Ethereum's executive legal office." Across the hall, Brett Halser sat at his desk, his phone vibrating non-stop. He stared blankly at a legal memo forwarded from Risk Management. It was marked Tier 1 Executive Priority. His face turned pale as the words sank in. Dominic Vale wasn't just some elite flyer. He was the architect behind the software foundation of their entire operational infrastructure, and he'd been watching, recording, waiting. Elsewhere in the city, in a high-rise overlooking the river, Dominic sat at the edge of a walnut conference table. His assistant handed him a tablet displaying the crew roster, paired with flagged audio logs and behavior reports. Dominic scrolled through the file without emotion, his fingers steady. "What do you want to do with them?" his assistant asked, his voice low, unsure whether to whisper or speak plainly. Dominic's gaze remained fixed on the screen. "Nothing yet. Let them see the walls tilt. Let the company feel the gravity of its own choice." He looked up. "I'm not going to fire anyone." The assistant looked surprised. "You're not?" "No," Dominic said calmly. "I'll make the company decide to fire them for me." "Mr. Vale," the voice on the other end of the call began, cautious and tight, "I want to express our deepest apologies for what occurred aboard Flight 418. It does not represent our values." Dominic Vale didn't answer at first. He stood by the tall windows of his office suite. The city skyline stretched out beneath him like circuitry. Lights, grids, movement, all orderly, all under control. He stared at his reflection in the glass, arms folded behind his back, silent. Julian Merrick, CEO of Mariner Airlines, waited. The line crackled faintly as if nervous. Still, Dominic said nothing. "I understand the embarrassment caused," Merrick continued, voice faltering. "It was never our intention to—" "You don't need to explain your intentions, Julian," Dominic interrupted, his tone smooth but cutting. "You need to understand your consequences." There was a pause. Then Julian tried again, slower this time. "I'd like to meet. In person, if possible. We can make this right." Dominic turned slightly, now facing the sleek, matte black console on his desk. He tapped the screen once. A file opened. Crew rosters, maintenance agreements, Ethereum's proprietary systems embedded in every Mariner aircraft. He didn't need to threaten. He only needed to remind. "You have 48 hours," he said flatly, "to submit a corrective plan, or every Ethereum maintenance and software license your fleet runs on will be deactivated for compliance review." He let the words hang in the air, unadorned, unshaken. His voice wasn't angry. It was surgical. On the other end, Julian sucked in a breath. "You wouldn't." "You know I would," Dominic cut in. He paced slowly now, the hush of his steps echoing in the polished floor. "My staff was humiliated. I was publicly removed from a seat my company's technology literally powers." He paused, letting that irony settle like dust in a sealed room. "I don't need compensation. I need accountability." There was only silence now. Dominic ended the call without waiting for a reply. The finality of the click felt like the closing of a vault door. Across the city, inside Mariner Airlines' central headquarters, panic had already begun to bloom. Within the hour, Julian convened an emergency meeting with the board of directors. The mood was grim, tension like static clinging to every suit and tie in the room. "This isn't just a PR disaster," said Conrad Vellon, the airline's general counsel. He was pale, tapping a pen against a stack of documents. "If Ethereum pulls its software licenses, we're grounded." Literally, Julian sat at the head of the long glass table, his hands clasped tightly. He said, 48 hours. "And he meant it," muttered another director. He didn't raise his voice once. Julian looked around the room. "We have to act now. Begin immediate review. I want every name involved on that flight. Crew, supervisory staff, ground handlers, full logs, internal messages, security footage, all of it." The order traveled like a pulse through the hierarchy, and by nightfall, a secondary, quieter meeting was assembled, this time inside one of the training rooms at Mariner's aviation terminal. A projector buzzed to life, illuminating the faces of 4 cabin crew members seated around a table. Mark Delvin, Brett Halser, and 2 others who had worked Flight 418. The room was dim, clinical, stripped of ceremony. The manager overseeing the session, a stern man named Clark Evenden, folded his arms as he stood at the front. "You all know why you're here," he said. Mark glanced sideways, his usual swagger replaced by something rigid. "We were told this was a review." "It is." But not the kind you think. Brett leaned forward, trying to sound composed. "We followed standard operating procedure. The seat change was cleared by—" "You reassigned the CEO of Ethereum Holdings," Clark cut him off, "in front of passengers. For a retiree who didn't even request it, and then joked about it afterward." The air tightened. Mark sat back, silent now. Clark clicked a remote and footage played across the wall. It showed Mark motioning toward the economy cabin, Brett looming behind, and Dominic Vale standing motionless, his voice inaudible, but his composure unmistakable. The video continued to the moment Dominic stepped aside, every frame damning. When the clip ended, Clark lowered the projector light. "You've embarrassed this company. You've endangered our operational future, and you've triggered a compliance threat that could shut down half our flights." Mark's jaw tensed. "So we're scapegoats now?" "No," Clark replied coldly. "Your consequences." One of the other attendants stood, his face pale. "So we're fired?" Clark's voice dropped to a quieter register. "Not by me." Dominic Vale gave us a choice. To do it ourselves, he handed out 4 sealed envelopes. "This is your chance to resign voluntarily and preserve some dignity. The alternative is termination with cause, and trust me, those memos have already been drafted." Mark opened his envelope slowly. Inside, a resignation form and a formal statement of conduct breach. "Why would he give us a chance?" Brett muttered. Clark looked at him and said simply, "Because he didn't want revenge. He wanted us to choose better." The room was silent again. Back in his private suite, Dominic watched the notification flash across his screen. "Crew disciplinary action confirmed." His assistant entered quietly, holding a fresh folder of reports. "It's done," the assistant said. Dominic didn't look up. He merely nodded once, eyes still on the screen. "They thought I was a passenger," he said quietly. "I was their employer." "No, he gave us a chance to do it ourselves. The attendant demanded he move to economy so a white passenger could sit in his place. If you believe power abused always collapses, hit subscribe now, because justice doesn't shout, it acts." The footage hit the networks like a spark to dry grass. Dominic Vale hadn't even left his suite when the first video surfaced. Grainy, handheld, but undeniable. It showed the moment he was asked to vacate his VIP seat. The angle was shaky, but the audio was crystal clear. Mark Delvin's voice rang out with that clipped tone of superiority. "You'll need to move to economy." Then Dominic's calm reply, "You're making a mistake." The clip didn't show outrage, it showed restraint, and that, somehow, made it more powerful. Within hours, the video spread across business networks and tech forums, picked up by digital outlets that catered to professionals and industry leaders. The headline that gained the most traction read, "Ethereum CEO removed from VIP seat by airline crew." Below it, analysts dissected the 23-second video frame by frame, Dominic's posture, the attendant's dismissiveness, the awkward expressions of the surrounding passengers. They called it a case study in composure. Others called it a corporate iceberg moment. The surface incident revealing something much. Dominic stood in front of his floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of the city winking through the dusk. He had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie. The silence in his penthouse was broken only by the low hum of a television across the room, where news anchors now debated whether Mariner Airlines had committed a racial oversight, a branding disaster, or an executive misfire of historic proportions. He didn't move. His assistant, Jonah Marin, sat at the kitchen counter, laptop open, eyes darting between tabs. We've had 64 inbound requests for comment, Jonah said, scrolling. 14 from press, 8 from institutional investors, even a couple from competitors pretending to be concerned. Dominic didn't look away from the skyline. Any internal reactions? Jonah nodded. Legal says we're in clean standing to escalate. Ethics says we've already done more than most would. HR asked if you want to formally file a dignity clause violation. A pause. I already did, Dominic said quietly. Jonah stopped typing. His face softened, not out of pity, but out of respect. He could sense that Dominic wasn't just angry. He was transforming the entire situation into something bigger, something permanent. The notification tone pinged from Dominic's phone. He glanced down. A message from Nathan Corvin, his chief legal advisor, blinked on the screen. Mariner wants to issue a public apology tomorrow. They're asking to meet in person. Dominic's jaw tensed. He turned from the window and walked slowly across the room, his shoes silent on the polished hardwood. He picked up the phone, read the message again, and then typed a response with deliberate calm. They'll apologize, but not to me. To everyone who's ever been told to move back. He stared at the words a second longer, then hit send. He wasn't thinking about vindication. He was thinking about the symbol that seat had become. They hadn't just displaced him physically, they'd displaced an idea. And now he had the opportunity to redefine it. Across the city, in media offices and corporate lounges, people watched the clip again and again. Some analysts began drawing comparisons to other public mishandlings of power, airline gaffes, celebrity confrontations, but none carried the same quiet resonance. One editor at a business ethics magazine wrote, Dominic Vail didn't protest. He just stood still and absorbed the insult and somehow made the entire room feel smaller for it. At Etherion's headquarters, morale swelled. Internal chat threads lit up with employees sharing their admiration. One engineer wrote, Our CEO just taught the world how to answer a slap with silence and still break the hand that swung. Dominic returned to the desk and reopened his laptop. Footage had already been archived, analyzed, and indexed. Jonah forwarded a message from the Data Integrity Division. It read simply, Evidence package complete. Recommended action, escalated internal review of Mariner compliance. Dominic didn't reply. He already knew what would happen next. He scrolled past the footage and opened a document titled Flight Integrity Protocol, Draft 1. It was something he had outlined months ago, an unfinished vision of what passenger dignity enforcement might look like if powered by the same logic as aerospace safety audits. He read it again, line by line, as if seeing it through a new lens. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a blueprint. The chair behind him creaked as he leaned back, hands folding under his chin. Across the room, the television anchor read aloud from a growing thread, CEO, humiliated in his own aircraft's cabin. Didn't shout, didn't sue, just waited. And now, Dominic thought, it begins. He rose and stepped once more toward the window, the city alive with motion below. Somewhere in the distance, another flight lifted off the runway, blinking red against the darkening sky. He thought of every executive who'd been told they were too difficult. Every passenger shifted because of someone else's assumption. Every quiet humiliation, deeper beneath. He whispered to no one. They turned the seat into a symbol. Then he closed his eyes and with a calm that chilled more than fury ever could, he finished the sentence aloud. Now it's going to mean something else entirely. Cameras flashed the moment Julian Merrick stepped behind the podium, his face pale beneath the stage lights, collar slightly askew as if even his wardrobe resisted the weight of what he was about to say. The Mariner Airlines press conference had been hastily assembled, yet the room was packed. Reporters, analysts, staff, and a few silent passengers who had quietly filmed the now infamous Flight 418 incident. Screens in the background displayed Mariner's blue and silver logo on loop, a stark contrast to the growing tension in the room. Merrick adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began. "We deeply regret the conduct displayed by members of our crew toward Mr. Dominic Vale," he read aloud, voice flat but trembling at the edges. "Effective immediately, we are implementing full inclusivity and respect training across all flight divisions." His hands, gripping the podium, betrayed the nervous twitch of a man who knew the cost of public failure. Around him, executives stood with strained expressions, nodding at every sentence, hoping performance could substitute for sincerity. A reporter in the front row stood abruptly, notebook in hand. "Can you confirm the crew has been dismissed?" she asked sharply. Merrick hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, the crew involved has been removed from duty." He tried to move on, but murmurs rippled across the press pit. The acknowledgement, though expected, carried weight, the kind that made headlines. Another journalist raised his hand, but before he could speak, a voice from the side asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Will Mr. Vale be pursuing legal action?" Merrick flinched almost imperceptibly. There was a pause, then the back doors to the room opened briefly. A suited man entered quietly and whispered to an aide near the side wall, who checked his tablet, nodded, and tapped something on the screen. At that very moment, in a luxury conference suite miles away, Dominic Vale watched the live stream with steady eyes. He was alone. Sunlight poured in behind him, reflecting off the chrome fixtures of the room like a stage light illuminating a quiet actor. The television played the broadcast silently. Dominic did not need to hear the words. He saw them in the tension of Merrick's brow, the hesitations, the fear disguised as corporate humility. On the screen, Merrick's lips moved again. "We recognize that the treatment Mr. Vale received was not only disrespectful, but unacceptable in any professional environment. We are grateful for the opportunity to correct course." Then, as if on cue, a reporter followed up. "Has Mariner Airlines made any restitution?" Merrick answered, "We're in direct communication with Mr. Vale's office." "At this time, we cannot disclose specifics," but Dominic was not in talks with Merrick. In fact, he hadn't responded to any of the airline's internal calls that morning. Instead, while the world was watching Merrick stumble through apologies, Dominic had already finished executing a quiet transaction: the acquisition of a minority stake in Mariner Airlines through Ethereum's investment arm, a decision signed at dawn. The real influence wasn't public. It was procedural. With a few digital strokes, Dominic had authorized the creation of a new internal charter, one that would require all airlines partnered with Ethereum to undergo rigorous ethical certification audits. Not as an option, but as a prerequisite. These audits would evaluate every aspect of airline conduct, from crew training to passenger complaint handling, using biometric transparency and AI-assisted fairness modeling developed in-house. Mariner would be the first. Back at the press conference, a reporter seated near the middle whispered, almost in awe, "He didn't destroy them. He reprogrammed them." The email arrived quietly, without fanfare, at 6:42 a.m. Dominic Vale sat at the edge of his bed, the pale morning light cutting sharp lines across the dark wood floor of his Arcadia suite. He wore no suit now, just a simple charcoal t-shirt and wool slacks, as he read through the forwarded document on his tablet. It was a final compliance report from Mariner Airlines' internal operations team, confirming the rollout of new ethics protocols across their flight crew divisions. Attached was a message. Per Ethereum ethics integration requirements, full retraining of all FA personnel has commenced across all national hubs. Supervisory audits begin next week. Dominic exhaled slowly. It had begun. The Ethics Integration Division, a new entity birthed from humiliation, forged in silence, was no longer an internal memo. It was now the sharp edge of change slicing through outdated routines. Each module had been personally reviewed by Dominic and his assistant, built not on legalese or empty slogans, but on lived principle. He had made certain of that. Across terminals and tarmacs, uniformed men now gathered in silent rooms lit by projectors and uncomfortable truths. A screen flashed. Bias is invisible until it costs everything. The footage that followed wasn't dramatized. It was the uncut recording from Flight 418, his quiet confrontation, the smirk on Mark Delvin's face, the crew's casual dismissal, and his own words. "You'll remember this evening longer than I will." Some trainees shifted uncomfortably. Others stared forward, transfixed. By the third week, letters began arriving. Handwritten, typed, scanned and emailed from across the company's vast network. Pilots, mechanics, baggage handlers, men who had never met Dominic but had heard. One note, scribbled on lined paper, read, "You didn't just save a reputation. You saved our conscience." He kept that one. Nathan Corvin brought it up at the quarterly board dinner. The setting was sleek, minimalist, the kind of place where every wine glass cost more than a week's groceries. Still, Nathan raised his own without theatrics. "To the man who turned an insult into an industry model," he said, voice firm but warm. Dominic didn't reply immediately. His eyes were fixed on the glass, the way light caught the surface, refracted back like the quiet satisfaction he refused to display too openly. When he did smile, it was a brief curve of the lips, as if to say, "We're just getting started." The real revelation came later that evening, not in a meeting, but in a headline. He was reading a late article forwarded by his assistant, a business journalist's quiet scoop tucked beneath the day's noise. The title was blunt: "Ethereum's Next Aircraft Line, the Vale Class." He blinked once. There it was. The piece described Ethereum's upcoming prototype fleet, sleek, energy-efficient, and embedded with new biometric transparency protocols designed to eliminate discriminatory seating patterns, crew preferences, and response delays. The technology would recognize all passengers based on urgency, health, and status, not race, attire, or unspoken bias. It would observe, but not judge, prioritize, but not stereotype. It was equality engineered, not just mandated. And the fleet's name? The Vale Class. Not a marketing stunt. A quiet tribute initiated by the internal development team without Dominic's knowledge. The name had been unanimously approved in a round of confidential voting among Ethereum engineers. Dominic sat alone as he read, the cityscape stretching beyond the glass behind him. His heart was steady, but full. He didn't need applause. He never had. But in that moment, he felt something deeper than pride, something closer to peace. He folded the tablet shut and set it aside. The city below buzzed with light, unaware of the quiet revolutions happening behind closed doors. He whispered the words aloud to no one in particular, the corners of his mouth soft with meaning. "Sometimes you don't raise your voice, you raise the standard." Dominic Vale stood near the edge of the grand marble terrace, his reflection stretching out in the glass wall behind him as the sun dipped over Arcadia City. The aerospace summit was wrapping up, but the air still buzzed with clinks of champagne flutes, murmured industry gossip, and the low hum of classical music from a string quartet near the fountains. Executives and engineers mingled in polished suits, but Dominic remained still, his eyes trained on the skyline. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to listen, to observe the system he had nudged into transformation. That was when he noticed him, a young man in a cadet blue Flight Academy uniform standing stiff near the banquet table, glancing at Dominic as if trying to summon courage. His name tag read T. Delvin. The surname struck Dominic like a flicker of static. He didn't move, but his attention sharpened. The cadet hesitated, then approached. "Sir," the young man began, voice tight with nerves, "I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to say something, before I lose the nerve." Dominic turned to face him fully. His posture was relaxed, but his expression remained unreadable. My name is Theo Delvin, the cadet said quickly, then paused. My father was on Flight 418. Mark Delvin. There it was, the name. A memory pressed itself sharply against Dominic's chest. The smirk, the clipped dismissal, the forced smile at landing. He said nothing, letting the moment breathe, letting the young man's presence stand on its own merit. I know what you must think, Theo added, noticing the silence, and maybe you have every right to think it. But my father changed. Dominic's eyebrows lifted slightly. He never talked about that day in detail, Theo continued, staring down at his shoes. But he told me he made a mistake. A big one. He said that losing his job didn't break him. It made him face himself. He started volunteering with returning veterans, took ethics courses, even helped train new attendants. Unpaid. Dominic studied the young man. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only a quiet weight, like someone dragging his father's name through a field of thorns, not to clear it, but to learn from where it snagged. Theo met his gaze finally. He said losing that job taught him more about respect than 20 years in service. The words hung there, raw and unpolished, but honest. Dominic felt something shift inside. Not forgiveness, something quieter, recognition, the realization that what he had set into motion had reached beyond contracts and policy. He extended a hand. Theo took it, almost startled. "What's your goal, Cadet Delvin?" Dominic asked, his voice steady. "To earn what he lost," Theo replied, "and to serve better than he ever did." Dominic nodded slowly. "Then make sure you never forget this moment. Not the shame that brought you here, but the choice you're making now." The handshake held for another second before Dominic turned back toward the terrace edge. As Theo walked away into the crowd, Dominic stood alone again, the horizon smeared with the final brush of sunset. His assistant, Leon Veyran, stepped beside him, holding a glass of water instead of wine. "You didn't say much," Leon noted, watching the cadet disappear into the crowd. "I didn't need to," Dominic replied quietly. Leon smiled. "You've changed the system without declaring war." Dominic watched the clouds reflect off the glass buildings in the distance. His voice dropped to a whisper, but his words cut through the soft string music and murmurs like a precise blade. "That's the only kind of war worth fighting." The conference room on the top floor of the Ethereum Holdings Executive Tower was quiet, the kind of quiet reserved for moments when decisions could alter industries. The walls of glass reflected the steel skyline of Arcadia City, casting long shadows across the matte black boardroom table where two men sat in silence. One was Dominic Vale, composed as ever, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Across from him sat Julian Merrick, the CEO of Mariner Airlines, his suit crisp, his demeanor less so. The tension between them didn't need acknowledgement, it radiated from the unsaid. Julian broke the silence. "Mr. Vale," he began, clearing his throat, "I want to thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this isn't easy." Dominic's expression didn't change. He waited. Julian continued, his voice wavering just as lightly. "What happened on Flight 418, what my crew did to you, was inexcusable. We've implemented internal changes since, but frankly," he paused, drawing a breath, "they're not enough." Not after the damage. Dominic's gaze remained steady. He had no intention of helping Julian feel comfortable. The airline executive reached into his leather folder and slid a document across the table. "This is a draft proposal. We'd like Ethereum's help in developing a new internal culture framework, something enforceable, something that ensures respect isn't optional, no matter the passenger's background." For the first time, Dominic looked down at the proposal. He didn't pick it up, just scanned the heading. Project Concord, Corporate Ethics and Passenger Equality Charter. His eyes returned to Julian, unreadable. "And this," Julian added, his voice more hopeful now, "wouldn't just apply to us." We're prepared to back its rollout across our partner networks, other carriers, subsidiaries, even training institutions. Dominic leaned back slightly, his voice soft but firm. Only if it extends beyond your airline. This will become industry-wide. Julian blinked. You want to scale it? Dominic nodded. Not just scale it. Rebuild the protocol from the ground up, from hiring to training to in-flight policy. This isn't just about one crew. It's about correcting an entire structure that allowed them to act that way. There was a long silence. Then Julian said, We're willing. Dominic finally picked up the proposal, flipping a few pages. Then we'll begin with what should have been obvious from the start, codifying respect into compliance, not courtesy. By week's end, Etherion and Mariner had formally announced a joint reform program, the Flight Integrity Initiative. It began as a private restructuring plan, but the press caught wind of it fast. Business journals dubbed it the Veil Accord, a quiet but powerful partnership between tech and transport, between ethics and enforcement. Within the first month, 4 more airlines signed on to the initiative. Within 3, it reached international partners. Dominic personally oversaw the architecture of the new platform, an AI-based transparency framework that flagged discriminatory trends in flight logs and staff evaluations. Every Etherian-partnered airline now had a new clause embedded in their contract. Failure to adopt the initiative meant automatic review of licensing agreements. Behind the scenes, boardrooms wrestled with the scale of what was happening. Some grumbled that Dominic Vale was overreaching. Others feared that the incident might ignite a domino effect. But the truth was clear. Change had arrived, and it wore a navy suit. Late one night, as Dominic walked the quiet halls of Etherion's innovation wing, he paused by a glass panel listing upcoming projects. Engineers passed by silently, nodding in respect. He thought of the humiliation he'd faced, not with bitterness, but clarity. His actions hadn't just corrected an injustice, they had established a template. He stood before a wide touchscreen that displayed an updated map of initiative adoption. Airline logos dotted the globe. A small notification appeared in the corner. Another CEO had requested a call to learn more about the Accord. Dominic smiled faintly. A voice came from behind. It was Nathan Corvin, his legal advisor. They keep saying you used silence as a weapon. Dominic looked at him. Not a weapon, he replied. A lever. Nathan chuckled. Same effect? Dominic turned back to the screen. The map glowed softly, a quiet constellation of reform. And in that moment he realized something deeper. Power wasn't about status or volume, it was about direction. And he had chosen forward. Every injustice, he reflected, is an opportunity to redesign the system that allowed it. Dominic Vale stepped into Terminal C of Hailborn International Airport with the quiet confidence of a man who had returned not for vindication, but reflection. No entourage, no security detail, no VIP lane. Just a dark overcoat over a slate gray suit, a leather carry-on in hand, and eyes that had seen the inside of boardrooms more dangerous than battlefields. The echo of his footsteps on the polished floor was drowned only by the distant murmur of departure announcements and rolling luggage. As he crossed the security checkpoint, a young male officer glanced at his ID, did a subtle double-take, and straightened his posture. "Welcome back, Mr. Vale," he said softly, handing it back with both hands. Dominic gave a polite nod, his expression unreadable. It had been exactly 1 year since the incident aboard Flight Mariner 418, since the humiliation, the reassignment, the smirks. Today's journey, however, was different. He wasn't flying to sign billion-dollar deals or launch reforms. He was flying because he chose to, because some journeys needed to be retraced to understand their full meaning. The concourse bustled around him, but people noticed. Male ground staff whispered, nudging each other discreetly. Others simply moved out of the way with quiet reverence, like city traffic parting before an unmarked motorcade. Dominic continued without hesitation, his eyes scanning the terminal not for flaws, but for progress. At gate 14, the same gate he had once boarded in silence, a young flight operations agent stepped forward, tall, no older than 24, with a pressed uniform and an eager nervousness in his voice. "Mr. Vale," he said, swallowing hard, "the cabin crew. They'd like to thank you for giving us a second chance to be better men." Dominic paused. His gaze settled gently on the young man's face, not searching for flattery, but sincerity. He could see the earnestness, the unpolished truth in the man's eyes. "The second chance wasn't mine to give," Dominic replied with quiet grace. "It was yours to earn." The young man's breath caught slightly as he nodded. "We won't forget that, sir." As Dominic walked down the jet bridge, the memories returned, not as wounds, but as lessons burned deep into the metal under his feet. This was the same route, the same aircraft model, the same airline, but everything had changed, and so had he. He stepped onto the aircraft slowly, taking in the quiet professionalism of the new male crew. The lead attendant, tall and composed, greeted him with a respectful bow of the head. No names, no fanfare, just acknowledgement. A subtle but important difference. Dominic moved through the front cabin until he reached the bulkhead where it had all begun, where a year ago he had been told, with veiled arrogance, to leave a seat he had earned. He paused there, not out of hesitation, but awareness. On the smooth metallic panel above the row, a plaque gleamed under the cabin light. It was small, no larger than a hand, but its message struck deeper than any headline ever had. "Reserved for all who earn respect." His eyes lingered on the words for a beat longer than expected. He turned, slid into the window seat directly beneath it, and exhaled as the hum of the engines began their slow, familiar song. This wasn't a seat of privilege anymore. It was a reminder of principle. The flight attendant walked past, offering a nod of respect rather than service. Dominic returned it silently. The sky outside darkened as twilight bled into the horizon. The wingtip glowed faintly red against the glass. Behind him, rows of passengers settled into quiet conversations, unaware that the man beside the plaque had once rewritten the code of their comfort. He opened a small leather journal from his coat pocket and jotted down a single line. Not for publication, not for statement, just for himself. "You do not rise to teach power its own failure. You rise to teach it balance." Closing the book, he let his hand rest lightly on the armrest. Beneath him, the aircraft vibrated softly, not from turbulence but from the invisible presence of a Therian system, flight navigation, fuel control, and interface design. His company's legacy ran through the aircraft like a nervous system, the same legacy that had once been rejected, only to become the spine of change. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Dominic turned his head toward the aisle. No cameras, no statements, no need, just a journey made whole. He looked once more at the plaque as the final boarding call echoed faintly in the cabin. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Dominic smiled faintly to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "The seat they took from me became the platform I built for everyone else." They took his seat in arrogance, and minutes later, he took their jobs in silence. If you believe dignity always finds its way back, subscribe now, because justice always boards first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, humiliation, and the power shift that happens when prejudice meets accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and remind viewers that respect and equality should never depend on appearance or assumption.